During my daughter's beach wedding, the groom suddenly demanded $50,000, leaving everyone around us in shock. His words carried an air of arrogance, as if he expected me to panic or lose control in front of the guests. Instead, I met his demand with a calm reaction, a composed smile that he clearly hadn't anticipated. The rain hammered against the windshield of Margaret's old Toyota Corolla as she gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, her 7-year-old daughter Emma sleeping fitfully in the back seat. The dashboard clock read 2:47 a.m., and they were somewhere outside of Denver, Colorado, driving through the darkness toward an uncertain future. Everything they owned was crammed into 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box that smelled faintly of the lavender detergent Margaret had used in what was once their home. 3 days earlier, Margaret had made the hardest decision of her life. After 12 years of walking on eggshells, of covering bruises with makeup, of making excuses for her husband's increasingly violent outbursts, she had finally found the courage to leave. The final straw had come when Richard raised his hand to Emma for the first time, his face twisted with the same rage Margaret knew all too well. That night, while he slept off another whiskey bender, Margaret had quietly packed their essentials and withdrawn every penny from their joint account, a modest $3,147 that represented her entire financial foundation. The Denver skyline emerged from the pre-dawn gloom like a promise of new beginnings. Margaret had chosen Colorado somewhat arbitrarily. It was far enough from their hometown of Phoenix to make Richard's threats of finding them feel empty, yet close enough that her aging Honda could make the journey without breaking down. She had no family to turn to. Richard had systematically isolated her from everyone over the years, and no college degree to fall back on. At 32, with a second-grade education and no work experience beyond the part-time cleaning jobs Richard had grudgingly allowed her to take, Margaret faced the daunting task of building a life from scratch. They spent their first week in a cramped motel room that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams. Emma, resilient as children often are, adapted quickly to their new reality, treating their situation like an extended adventure. She colored in coloring books while Margaret pored over classified ads in the local newspaper, circling every job listing that didn't require a college degree. The cleaning positions were familiar territory, but Margaret knew she needed something more stable, something that could support them both and maybe, just maybe, provide enough to give Emma the opportunities she herself had never had. Fortune smiled on them when Margaret landed a job at Mile High Office Solutions, a small cleaning company that serviced downtown Denver's business district. The work was demanding. She started at 4 a.m. and finished by noon, cleaning offices when they were empty and the city was still asleep. But Mrs. Henderson, the company owner, was a kind woman who understood Margaret's situation without requiring details. She paid Margaret $12 an hour under the table, no questions asked, and even helped her find a small one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that was safe enough for Emma to walk to the nearby elementary school. The apartment was a far cry from the suburban house they'd left behind. But Margaret transformed it into a home with second-hand furniture from thrift stores and Emma's artwork taped to the refrigerator. She worked days cleaning offices and evenings at a local diner, where the tips were modest, but every dollar counted toward their survival. Emma attended aftercare at school, doing her homework at a small table, while Margaret counted the day's earnings and planned their meals around whatever was on sale at the grocery store. Years blended together in a rhythm of work, school, and careful financial planning. Margaret discovered she had a gift for managing money, perhaps born from necessity, and slowly, incrementally, their situation improved. She saved for Emma's school supplies months in advance, celebrated every A on a report card like a personal victory, and tucked away whatever she could in a savings account that grew with agonizing slowness but undeniable persistence. Emma flourished in their new environment. Free from the tension that had permeated their old home, she threw herself into her studies with an intensity that both amazed and worried Margaret. By middle school, Emma was earning straight A's and talking about college with the kind of casual confidence that made Margaret's heart swell with pride and terror in equal measure. College had never been a possibility in Margaret's world, but Emma spoke of it as an inevitability. discussing universities and majors with the easy familiarity of someone who had never doubted their own potential. The financial reality of Emma's dreams kept Margaret awake at night. Even with her promotion to shift supervisor at Mile High Office Solutions and her steady income from the diner, college tuition seemed like an impossible mountain to climb. She researched scholarships and financial aid with the same methodical determination she brought to everything else, learning about student loans and grant applications as if studying for the most important test of her life. When Emma entered high school, Margaret took a third job cleaning houses on weekends. Her body ached constantly. Her back had never fully recovered from years of Richard's violence, and the physical demands of her work had only made it worse. But she pushed through the pain with a determination that had carried her through darker times. Emma, now old enough to understand the sacrifices being made on her behalf, threw herself into her studies with renewed intensity. Maintaining a perfect GPA while participating in every extracurricular activity that might strengthen her college applications. The guidance counselor at Emma's high school, Mrs. Rodriguez, became an unexpected ally in their college planning. She helped Emma navigate the complex world of applications and essays, and she was the first person to suggest that Emma's academic record might qualify her for merit-based scholarships. Margaret attended every college information session, taking notes in the careful handwriting she'd taught herself to improve, asking questions about costs and financial aid with the desperate precision of someone for whom every dollar mattered. By Emma's senior year, their small apartment was filled with college brochures and scholarship applications. Margaret had saved $23,000 over 11 years, a sum that seemed simultaneously enormous and woefully inadequate when measured against tuition, costs that exceeded $40,000 per year at many of the schools Emma was considering. But they had hope, and hope had carried them further than Margaret had ever dared to dream possible. The acceptance letter from Northwestern University arrived on a cold February morning, and Emma's screams of joy could be heard throughout their building. Margaret held the letter with trembling hands, reading about merit scholarships and financial aid packages that would make Emma's dreams possible. The total cost after aid would still be substantial, nearly $15,000 per year, but it was manageable. Barely, if Margaret continued working all 3 jobs and Emma contributed through work-study programs. As Margaret watched her daughter dance around their small living room, acceptance letter clutched to her chest, she felt a deep satisfaction that transcended exhaustion and financial worry. They had done it. Against all odds, despite starting with nothing but determination and love, they had created a path to a better future. Emma would be the first in their family to attend college, the first to have choices that weren't dictated by circumstances or limited by the violence of men who confused power with love. That night, as Emma called her friends to share the good news, Margaret sat alone in her bedroom and allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She had sacrificed everything, her youth, her health, her own dreams, to give Emma opportunities she had never imagined possible. It had been worth every sleepless night, every aching muscle, every dollar carefully saved and stretched to its limit. Emma would graduate college, would build a career, would have the kind of independence Margaret had found only after escape and struggle. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility, and Margaret allowed herself to believe that the worst was behind them. 4 years later, Margaret stood in the crowded auditorium at Northwestern University, tears streaming down her face as she watched Emma cross the stage to receive her diploma. The young woman who had once done homework at a diner table while Margaret counted tips had graduated summa cum laude with a degree in business administration and a minor in fashion design. Margaret's hands ached from clapping and her back protested from the uncomfortable auditorium seats, but she had never felt prouder or more fulfilled. The years of Emma's college education had been a financial marathon that had tested every limit of Margaret's endurance. She had continued working her 3 jobs throughout Emma's undergraduate years, adding a 4th during busy seasons, holiday retail work that left her exhausted but brought in the extra money needed for Emma's textbooks and living expenses. The small apartment in Denver had become a shrine to Emma's achievements. Honor roll certificates, Dean's List notifications and photographs from various campus activities covered every available wall space. Emma had thrived at Northwestern, not just academically, but socially. She had joined the business club, participated in fashion shows organized by student groups, and completed internships at prestigious Chicago firms. Her Instagram account, which Margaret followed with the devoted attention of any proud parent, was filled with images of a life Margaret could barely recognize as connected to their humble beginnings. Emma at networking events, posing with classmates against the backdrop of Chicago's skyline, attending fashion weeks and industry conferences. During winter break of Emma's senior year, Margaret had noticed a change in her daughter. Emma seemed more confident, more polished, speaking with easy familiarity about business concepts and industry trends that were completely foreign to Margaret. She had developed a sophisticated vocabulary peppered with terms like market positioning, brand identity, and capital investment that made Margaret simultaneously proud and slightly intimidated. "Mom," Emma had said one evening as they sat in their small living room, "I've been thinking about what comes next after graduation." Margaret had assumed Emma would move back to Denver temporarily while job hunting, or perhaps relocate to Chicago where she had made connections during her internships. The cost of Emma's job search, professional clothes, travel for interviews, temporary housing, was already keeping Margaret awake at night, but she had been quietly setting aside money for exactly these expenses. "I want to start my own business," Emma announced, her voice carrying the kind of confidence that Margaret remembered from Emma's childhood declarations that she would attend college when such dreams seemed impossible. "I've been developing a business plan for a boutique, high-end women's fashion with a focus on sustainable and ethically made pieces. There's a real gap in the market for accessible luxury that doesn't compromise on values." Margaret listened with growing amazement as Emma outlined her vision. Her daughter spoke passionately about market research she had conducted, about relationships she had built with emerging designers, about location scouting she had done in Chicago's trendy neighborhoods. Emma had graphs and charts, projected profit margins, and detailed analyses of her target demographic. It was clear that this wasn't a whimsical post-graduation fantasy, but a carefully researched and thoughtfully planned business venture. "The initial investment would be substantial," Emma continued, her eyes bright with entrepreneurial excitement. "I've run the numbers multiple times, and I would need approximately $97,000 to secure a lease in the right location, purchase initial inventory, handle renovation costs, and maintain operating expenses for the first 6 months while building a customer base." Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. $97,000. The number seemed to hover in the air between them like a physical presence. Margaret's entire life savings, accumulated through 15 years of relentless work and careful financial planning, totaled just over $40,000. She had been planning to use that money to finally address her deteriorating back condition. The doctors had been recommending surgery for years, and perhaps take a vacation, her first in over a decade. "I know it's a lot of money," Emma said quickly, interpreting Margaret's silence as hesitation. "But I've researched small business loans, and with your credit score and my business plan, we could definitely secure the financing. You would need to co-sign initially, but once the business establishes its credit history, I could refinance everything in the company's name." Margaret's mind raced through the implications. Co-signing meant her financial security would be tied to the success of Emma's business. If the boutique failed, Margaret would be responsible for a debt that exceeded twice her annual income. At 51, with a body worn down by decades of physical labor, she couldn't afford a financial catastrophe. But as she looked at Emma's face, radiant with hope and determination, Margaret saw echoes of the 7-year-old girl who had colored pictures while Margaret searched for jobs in motel rooms. Emma had never asked for anything frivolous, had worked part-time throughout college despite her demanding course load, and had earned every opportunity that had come her way. This wasn't a whim. This was Emma's chance to build the kind of life Margaret had always dreamed her daughter might have. "Tell me more about the business plan," Margaret said finally. Over the following weeks, Emma presented her research with the thoroughness of a doctoral dissertation. She had identified a prime location in Lincoln Park, a trendy Chicago neighborhood with high foot traffic and an affluent demographic. The space had previously housed a successful gallery, so it already had the kind of sophisticated atmosphere that would appeal to Emma's target customers. Emma had networked with designers from sustainable fashion programs at various art schools, building relationships with emerging talents who were eager to have their work featured in a boutique setting. Most impressively, Emma had already begun cultivating a social media presence around her business concept. Her Instagram account, rebranded as Conscious Closet, featured carefully curated content about sustainable fashion, behind-the-scenes looks at her business planning process, and partnerships with micro-influencers who shared her values. She had built a following of over 15,000 potential customers before the business even existed. Margaret found herself caught up in Emma's enthusiasm. The business plan was thorough and well-researched, addressing potential challenges with realistic solutions and conservative projections that accounted for various market conditions. Emma had even identified potential expansion opportunities, discussing the possibility of online sales and eventual additional locations with the kind of long-term strategic thinking that impressed Margaret deeply. The financial discussions were more complex. Emma's research had revealed that traditional small business loans for retail ventures required substantial collateral and had stringent qualification requirements that would be difficult for a recent graduate to meet independently. However, with Margaret as a co-signer and primary investor, they could structure the arrangement as a partnership rather than a simple loan. "I was thinking," Emma said during one of their planning sessions, "that you could be a silent partner. You would own 51% of the business initially. That gives you majority control and protects your investment, while I handle all the day-to-day operations and management. As the business grows and generates profit, I can buy back shares until we're equal partners, and eventually I can buy out your stake entirely if you want to retire." The arrangement addressed Margaret's practical concerns while giving Emma the creative and operational control she needed to build her vision. Margaret would provide the financial foundation, but Emma would be responsible for execution, marketing, inventory management, and customer relations. It seemed like a perfect synthesis of Margaret's hard-earned resources and Emma's education and ambition. Margaret's decision crystallized during a conversation with Mrs. Henderson, her boss at Mile High Office Solutions. The older woman had become something of a mentor over the years, and Margaret trusted her judgment about business matters. "Sounds like that daughter of yours has a real head for business," Mrs. Henderson said, after Margaret outlined Emma's proposal. "And she's right about the market. My daughter's always complaining about how hard it is to find nice clothes that don't cost a fortune and aren't made in sweatshops. If Emma's as smart as you say, and if she's done her homework, it could be a real good opportunity." Mrs. Henderson paused, studying Margaret's face. "But you're scared about the money." Margaret nodded. "It's everything I have, plus more. If it doesn't work out." "Honey," Mrs. Henderson said gently, "you've spent 20 years sacrificing for that girl. Maybe it's time to invest in her instead of just supporting her. There's a difference between throwing good money after bad and backing someone you believe in." That evening, Margaret called Emma and told her she was ready to move forward. Emma's shriek of joy over the phone made Margaret smile despite her financial anxiety. They spent the next several weeks working with lawyers to structure their OD partnership agreement, with accountants to establish the business entity, and with bank loan officers to secure the additional financing they would need. Margaret liquidated her entire savings account, cashed out her modest 401k from Mile High Office Solutions despite the early withdrawal penalties, and took out a second mortgage on the small house she had finally been able to buy 3 years earlier. The total came to just over $60,000, her entire financial safety net, accumulated through decades of careful planning and self-denial. The remaining $37,000 came through a small business loan that required both Margaret's and Emma's signatures, with Margaret's house serving as additional collateral. The monthly payments would strain Margaret's budget significantly, requiring her to maintain all her current jobs plus take on additional weekend work, but the numbers were manageable if Emma's projections proved accurate. As Margaret signed document after document, transferring her life savings to support Emma's dream, she felt a complex mixture of terror and exhilaration. She was betting everything on her daughter's vision and ability, risking the financial security she had fought so hard to achieve. But watching Emma's excitement, seeing the careful planning and genuine passion behind the business proposal, Margaret felt confident that she was making the right choice. Emma was no longer the frightened 7-year-old sleeping in the back seat of their car as they fled toward an uncertain future. She was an educated, ambitious young woman with a solid business plan and the determination to succeed. Margaret had spent 2 decades preparing Emma for exactly this kind of opportunity. Now it was time to see if all those years of sacrifice would finally pay off, not just for Emma, but for both of them. 18 months later, Margaret stood outside the gleaming storefront of Conscious Closet, watching through the large windows, as customers browsed the carefully curated racks of sustainable fashion. The boutique had exceeded even Emma's optimistic projections, transforming from a risky investment into a thriving business that generated consistent profits and attracted a loyal customer base. The success had come faster than anyone had anticipated. 3 months after opening, a lifestyle influencer named Sophia Chen had discovered the boutique during a Chicago shopping trip and featured it prominently on her Instagram account, which boasted over 2 million followers. The post, which showcased several outfits from Conscious Closet alongside Emma's passionate explanation of the store's ethical sourcing practices, had gone viral within hours. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. The boutique's phone rang constantly with orders from customers across the country, the website crashed from traffic overload, and Emma had to hire 2 additional employees just to manage the influx of business. Within 6 months, Conscious Closet had a waiting list for certain designer pieces and had been featured in Vogue, Elle, and Sustainable Fashion Weekly. Margaret had watched this meteoric rise with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. The financial projections she had studied so carefully had proven conservative. The business was generating nearly twice the revenue Emma had predicted, and the profit margins were even healthier than their most optimistic scenarios. The monthly loan payments that had seemed daunting were now easily covered by Margaret's share of the profits, and she had been able to reduce her work schedule for the first time in decades. But something had changed in Emma during the boutique's rise to success, something that made Margaret increasingly uncomfortable during their monthly business meetings. Emma spoke about the boutique's achievements with a proprietary confidence that seemed to erase Margaret's fundamental role in making the dream possible. During interviews with fashion bloggers and business publications, Emma presented herself as a visionary entrepreneur who had bootstrapped her way to success through determination and innovative thinking. Margaret had initially attributed this to normal business marketing. She understood that Emma's personal story as a young, independent entrepreneur was more compelling to customers than the reality of maternal financial backing. But as months passed, the omission of Margaret's involvement became more complete and more troubling. The first time Margaret truly felt invisible was during a feature story in Chicago Business Monthly about successful young entrepreneurs. The article, titled "Building Dreams: How Emma Walsh Created Chicago's Hottest Sustainable Fashion Destination," included a photograph of Emma posed confidently in front of the boutique's signature green wall, surrounded by racks of ethically made clothing. Margaret read the article with growing discomfort as Emma described her journey from college student with a vision to successful business owner. There was no mention of Margaret's investment, no acknowledgement of the financial partnership that had made the boutique possible, no reference to the decades of sacrifice that had provided Emma with the opportunity to attend Northwestern and develop her business acumen. Instead, Emma was quoted as saying, "I've always believed that if you're passionate enough and willing to work hard enough, you can make anything happen. I started with just an idea and a lot of determination, and I've built this business from the ground up through careful planning and smart decision-making." The article included details about Emma's sustainable sourcing practices, her marketing strategies, and her plans for expansion. all presented as the innovations of a self-made entrepreneur. When asked about her funding sources, Emma had mentioned private investors who believed in my vision without any indication that her primary investor was her own mother, using her life savings. Margaret's discomfort deepened during a business meeting the following week. Emma had called the meeting to discuss expansion plans. She wanted to launch an e-commerce platform and was considering opening a second location in Minneapolis. The projections looked promising, and Margaret was pleased to see her investment continuing to grow, but she was struck by how Emma presented the information. "I've been analyzing our customer data," Emma said, spreading charts across the conference table they had installed in the boutique's back office. "My marketing strategies have been incredibly effective at building brand loyalty, and I think we're ready to scale up operations significantly." Margaret listened as Emma outlined her expansion plans. Using first-person pronouns throughout the presentation, "I've identified our key demographic. I've developed relationships with suppliers. I've created a brand identity that resonates with consumers." The language was subtle but consistent. Emma spoke about the business as if it were entirely her creation and her achievement. When Margaret gently reminded Emma that as the majority partner, she would need to approve any major expansion plans, Emma's response was polite but dismissive. "Of course, Mom, I know you're technically the majority shareholder, but you've always said you wanted to be a silent partner, and I've been handling all the operational decisions. I assumed you'd want me to continue managing the strategic direction of the business." The word "technically" lingered in Margaret's mind long after the meeting ended. She was not technically the majority shareholder. She was the majority shareholder, having invested her entire life savings to make Emma's dream possible. But somewhere along the way, Emma had begun treating Margaret's foundational contribution as a minor detail rather than the essential element that had made everything else possible. Margaret's growing unease crystallized during a networking event Emma had organized at the boutique. Local business owners, fashion bloggers, and potential customers mingled among the clothing racks while Emma gave impromptu presentations about sustainable fashion and ethical business practices. Margaret attended as a guest, watching from the sidelines as Emma confidently held court with Chicago's fashion elite. During Emma's formal presentation, she told the story of Conscious Closet's founding with the polished confidence of someone who had told it many times before. She spoke about identifying a gap in the market, about her research into sustainable fashion practices, about the challenges of launching a retail business in a competitive market. She discussed her marketing innovations, her supplier relationships, and her plans for growth. At no point did Emma mention Margaret's investment or partnership. When someone in the audience asked about her startup funding, Emma smiled and said, "I was fortunate to find investors who shared my vision for ethical fashion. It's amazing what you can accomplish when you find people who believe in what you're trying to build." Margaret stood in the back of the room, wearing one of her few nice dresses, purchased years ago for Emma's college graduation, and felt like a stranger at her own daughter's success story. The customers and business associates who surrounded Emma saw a brilliant young entrepreneur who had built something remarkable through her own talent and determination. None of them knew about the woman in the back of the room who cleaned offices at 4 a.m. to pay for Emma's college education, who had liquidated her retirement savings to fund Emma's vision, who had put her house up as collateral to secure the loans that made Conscious Closet possible. The feeling of invisibility was compounded by Emma's behavior toward her during these public events. Emma was warm and appreciative when they were alone, still calling regularly to share business updates and personal news. But in professional settings, Emma treated Margaret with the polite distance reserved for casual acquaintances rather than the recognition due to a business partner and financial backer. During the networking event, Margaret watched as Emma introduced her to various attendees simply as "my mother," without any mention of her role in the business. When a fashion blogger asked Emma about her family support system, Emma smiled and said, "My mom has always been incredibly supportive of my dreams. She taught me the value of hard work and determination." The response was technically true, but functionally misleading. Margaret had indeed taught Emma about hard work and determination, but more importantly, she had provided the financial foundation that made Emma's current success possible. The distinction between emotional support and material investment seemed to have blurred in Emma's public narrative until Margaret's concrete contributions had been transformed into abstract inspiration. Margaret began paying closer attention to how Emma discussed the business in various contexts. She followed Emma's social media accounts, read interviews and articles, and attended business events when invited. A consistent pattern emerged. Emma presented herself as a self-made entrepreneur who had succeeded through her own merit, vision, and hard work. Margaret's role, when acknowledged at all, was relegated to that of a supportive mother who had provided emotional encouragement. The financial reality of their partnership became increasingly invisible in Emma's public persona. The business was thriving, generating healthy profits that benefited both partners, but the credit for that success seemed to flow entirely to Emma's entrepreneurial brilliance rather than being shared between Emma's management skills and Margaret's foundational investment. Margaret found herself caught between pride in Emma's achievements and frustration with her own erasure from the success story. She had never wanted public recognition. Her motivation had always been Emma's happiness and success rather than personal acclaim. But the complete absence of acknowledgement felt like a betrayal of their partnership and a denial of the sacrifices that had made everything possible. The situation became more troubling when Emma began discussing future plans that seemed to assume Margaret's continued financial support without her meaningful involvement in decision-making. Emma spoke casually about expansion plans, about potential franchise opportunities, about building Conscious Closet into a national brand. These conversations treated Margaret as a funding source rather than a business partner, someone whose financial resources were essential but whose input was optional. Margaret began to wonder if Emma truly understood the magnitude of the investment she had made. Did Emma realize that Margaret had sacrificed her retirement security, her financial safety net, and her own dreams to fund the boutique? Did she comprehend that Margaret was still working multiple jobs to manage the loan payments, despite the business's success? Did she appreciate that Margaret's house remained collateral for the business loans, meaning that any failure would cost Margaret not just her investment, but her home? As Margaret watched Emma bask in well-deserved recognition for building a successful business, she felt increasingly like a ghost haunting her own success story. She had provided the foundation, but Emma had become the sole architect in everyone's eyes, including, it seemed, her own. The distance between them was growing, not in their personal relationship, but in their professional partnership. Emma was moving forward with the confidence of someone who had achieved success independently, while Margaret remained anchored by the financial realities of their shared investment and the growing certainty that her essential role in that success was being systematically erased from the narrative. The truth came to Margaret in the most mundane way possible: a forgotten laptop charger and a daughter's casual request for help. Emma had been working late at the boutique, preparing for Fashion Week presentations, when she called Margaret in a panic. "Mom, I'm such an idiot," Emma said, her voice crackling through Margaret's phone. "I left my laptop charger at home, and I have a huge presentation to finish tonight. Could you possibly grab it and bring it to me? I know it's a lot to ask, but I'm completely stuck without it." Margaret didn't hesitate. Despite everything, the growing distance, the erasure from Emma's success story, the nagging feeling that their partnership had somehow shifted into something less equal, Emma was still her daughter. Margaret drove to Emma's upscale Lincoln Park apartment, a space that the boutique's success had made possible, and used the key Emma had given her for emergencies. The apartment reflected Emma's transformation from college student to successful entrepreneur. High-end furniture, original artwork, and a walk-in closet filled with designer clothes created an atmosphere of sophisticated success that still amazed Margaret. She found the charger plugged in beside Emma's bed and was heading toward the door when Emma's laptop, sitting open on the dining table, chimed with an incoming email notification. The screen was awake, displaying what appeared to be a document titled Post-Wedding Strategy. Margaret's eyes fell on it accidentally, but what she saw made her freeze in place. Her own name appeared in the text, along with phrases that made her blood run cold: financial extraction timeline and minimizing ongoing obligations. Margaret stood frozen, charger in hand, staring at the laptop screen. She knew she should leave immediately, should respect Emma's privacy, should not read what was clearly a personal document. But her name was right there, and the words that surrounded it seemed to carry an ominous weight that made her heart race with sudden anxiety. She set the charger down and moved closer to the laptop, her hands trembling as she absorbed what she was seeing. The document was clearly a strategic plan, formatted with headers, bullet points, and action items. At the top of the page, in bold letters, was a title that made Margaret's stomach drop: Managing Mom, Post-Marriage Financial Independence Plan. The document was dated 3 weeks earlier. Shortly after Emma had announced her engagement to David Chen, Sophia's brother and a successful tech entrepreneur she had met through the influencer connection that had launched Conscious Closet's success. Margaret had been thrilled about the engagement, happy that Emma had found love with someone who shared her values and ambition. Now, reading Emma's laptop screen, Margaret realized the engagement represented something entirely different to her daughter. The document was organized into clear sections, each one more devastating than the last. The first section, titled Current Financial Obligations, contained a detailed analysis of Margaret's investment in Conscious Closet, her ongoing loan payments, and her majority ownership stake. Emma had calculated exactly how much money Margaret had invested, how much she continued to contribute through loan payments, and what her 51% ownership stake was worth based on the boutique's current valuation. The numbers were staggering. Conscious Closet was now worth an estimated $1.2 million, making Margaret's majority stake worth over $600,000 on paper. But Emma's document treated this not as Margaret's rightful return on investment, but as an obstacle to overcome. The second section, Post-Wedding Transition Strategy, outlined a plan to systematically reduce and eliminate Margaret's involvement in the business. Emma had detailed a timeline for buying out Margaret's ownership stake at below-market rates, using legal mechanisms that would pressure Margaret into selling. The plan included strategies for making Margaret's continued participation uncomfortable and unsustainable, including relocating business operations to make attendance at meetings difficult for Margaret, scheduling important decisions during Margaret's work hours, and gradually shifting business banking and legal relationships to accounts and firms that would prioritize Emma and David's interests. But it was the third section that truly broke Margaret's heart: emotional management and family boundaries. This section treated Margaret not as a business partner or even as a mother, but as a problem to be managed and eventually discarded. Emma had written, "Mom's emotional attachment to the business and expectation of ongoing involvement will need to be carefully managed during the transition period. She has become overly invested in receiving credit for the business's success and may resist efforts to establish appropriate boundaries between family relationships and professional partnerships." The document continued. "David agrees that clear boundaries will be essential for our marriage and our ability to grow the business without interference. We need to transition Mom from active partner to passive investor and ultimately to complete financial separation. The goal is to establish independence while minimizing emotional drama and potential legal complications." Margaret read each word with growing horror, her hands shaking as she scrolled through Emma's strategic plan to eliminate her from the business she had made possible. The language was clinical, professional, and utterly devoid of acknowledgement for Margaret's sacrifices. Emma wrote about her mother as if she were a problematic business associate, rather than the woman who had invested her life savings, her retirement security, and her home to make Emma's dreams possible. The fourth section, Financial Extraction Timeline, laid out specific strategies for accessing Margaret's resources while minimizing her ongoing influence. Emma planned to approach Margaret for additional investments in expansion projects, using emotional appeals about family legacy and shared dreams to secure more funding. Simultaneously, she would work to restructure the business partnership to reduce Margaret's voting rights and decision-making authority. The most chilling part of this section was Emma's analysis of Margaret's financial vulnerabilities. She had calculated that Margaret's ongoing loan obligations would create pressure to accept buyout offers, even at below-market rates. Emma wrote, "Mom's financial situation makes her vulnerable to pressure tactics. Her loan payments and lack of other retirement resources mean she will likely accept reasonable buyout offers to secure immediate cash flow. The final section, long-term family management, addressed how Emma and David plan to handle Margaret's ongoing presence in their lives after achieving financial independence. The language was gentle but unmistakably manipulative, outlining strategies for maintaining a relationship with Margaret while ensuring she could never again influence their financial decisions. Emma had written, "We want to maintain a positive relationship with Mom, but on our terms. Once we've achieved financial independence, we can afford to be more generous with emotional support and family time, since she won't have any leverage over our business or personal decisions. The key is to complete the financial separation before she realizes what's happening and can create obstacles." Margaret sank into Emma's dining chair, still staring at the laptop screen, trying to process what she was reading. This wasn't just a business plan. It was a blueprint for systematic betrayal, crafted by the daughter she had sacrificed everything to support. Emma had analyzed Margaret's love, generosity, and trust with the cold calculation of a hostile takeover, identifying weaknesses to exploit and emotions to manipulate. The document included detailed character assessments that reduced Margaret's decades of sacrifice to strategic disadvantages. Emma had written, "Mom's need for validation and recognition makes her vulnerable to emotional appeals. Her financial inexperience and trust in family relationships mean she's unlikely to seek independent legal advice or question our proposals. Her work schedule and lack of business sophistication create opportunities to make decisions without her meaningful input." Reading these words, Margaret realized that Emma had been studying her, analyzing her psychology and circumstances, not as a daughter seeking to understand her mother, but as a predator identifying the weaknesses of prey. Every conversation about the business, every family dinner, every moment of shared pride in Conscious Closet's success had been filtered through Emma's strategic assessment of how to best exploit Margaret's love and trust. The document's final paragraph was the most devastating of all. "The ultimate goal is complete financial and emotional independence. Once we control 100% of Conscious Closet and have established our other business ventures, we can afford to be generous with Mom without risking our autonomy. She deserves to be comfortable in her retirement, but not at the expense of our ability to build our own legacy. This transition needs to happen quickly, before she becomes more sophisticated about business matters or seeks outside advice that could complicate our plans." Margaret sat in Emma's expensive apartment, surrounded by the luxury that her investment had made possible, and felt the complete destruction of everything she had believed about their relationship. Emma hadn't just planned to betray her. She had planned to do it with sophisticated manipulation designed to make Margaret grateful for her own exploitation. The woman Margaret had raised, educated, and empowered had become someone capable of viewing her mother's love as a weakness to exploit and her sacrifices as obstacles to overcome. Emma had not only erased Margaret from her success story, she had planned to erase her from her future entirely, while accessing every possible dollar from Margaret's resources in the process. Margaret heard Emma's key in the apartment door and quickly stepped away from the laptop, grabbing the charger with hands that shook so violently she nearly dropped it. Emma entered with her usual bright smile, embracing Margaret with what now felt like calculated affection. "You're a lifesaver, Mom," Emma said warmly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The words that once would have filled Margaret with pride now felt like mockery. Emma didn't know what she'd do without Margaret because she was still extracting value from their relationship. But according to her strategic plan, she was actively working toward finding out exactly what life would be like without Margaret's influence, support, or involvement. Margaret managed to smile and hand over the charger, exchanging pleasantries about Emma's presentation and upcoming wedding plans. Every word felt hollow. Every gesture of affection felt like performance. Every expression of gratitude felt like manipulation designed to keep Margaret compliant until Emma's extraction plan could be completed. As Margaret drove home through Chicago's evening traffic, she felt something fundamental shift inside her. The innocent, trusting woman who had sacrificed everything for her daughter's success was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the true nature of the relationship she had invested her life in creating. Emma had not just betrayed their business partnership, she had weaponized Margaret's love, turning every maternal instinct and generous impulse into a tool for her own advancement. The daughter Margaret had raised to be strong, independent, and successful had used those very qualities to plan the systematic exploitation and abandonment of the woman who had made her strength possible. For the first time in decades, Margaret began to plan not for Emma's benefit, but for her own survival. The wedding was everything Emma had dreamed of, an elegant affair at the Chicago Botanic Garden with 200 guests, locally sourced, catering and flowers arranged to complement the sustainable fashion theme that had made Emma's fortune. Margaret sat in the front row, wearing a navy dress she had purchased specifically for the occasion, watching her daughter exchange vows with David Chen under a canopy of white roses and baby's breath. To the assembled guests, Margaret appeared to be the proud mother of the bride, beaming with joy as Emma promised to love, honor, and cherish her new husband. But beneath Margaret's composed exterior, she was executing a plan that had taken 3 weeks of careful preparation and strategic positioning. The woman who had once sacrificed everything out of love was now prepared to protect everything she had left. The discovery of Emma's betrayal had transformed Margaret in ways she was still processing. The initial shock and heartbreak had given way to a cold clarity that reminded her of the night she had fled Phoenix with 7-year-old Emma sleeping in the back seat. Then, as now, survival required immediate action and absolute resolve. The difference was that this time, Margaret was not running from danger. She was preparing to confront it. In the 3 weeks since discovering Emma's strategic plan, Margaret had conducted her own careful research and preparation. She had quietly consulted with Sarah Martinez, a business attorney who specialized in partnership disputes and had been recommended by Mrs. Henderson. Sarah had listened to Margaret's situation with professional sympathy and tactical precision, immediately recognizing the legal vulnerabilities in Emma's planned extraction strategy. "Your daughter made a critical error," Sarah had explained during their first meeting. "As the majority shareholder, you have significant legal protections that she's apparently underestimated. Her plan assumes you'll be passive and compliant. But if you're willing to exercise your rights as majority owner, you have considerably more leverage than she realizes." Sarah had helped Margaret understand the full scope of her legal position. As the 51% owner of Conscious Closet, Margaret had the authority to make unilateral decisions about major business operations, including financial audits, management changes, and asset transfers. Emma's expansion plans, her salary arrangements, and her authority to make business decisions all existed at Margaret's discretion, though Margaret had never exercised this control out of respect for their family relationship. But family relationships, Margaret had learned, were a luxury she could no longer afford. Working with Sarah, Margaret had prepared a comprehensive legal response to Emma's betrayal. They had documented every aspect of Margaret's investment in Conscious Closet, including the liquidation of her savings, the second mortgage on her house, and the ongoing loan payments that Margaret continued to make. They had analyzed the business's current valuation and confirmed that Margaret's stake was worth significantly more than the below-market buyout amounts Emma had planned to offer. More importantly, Sarah had helped Margaret prepare for what was about to unfold. They had coordinated with a forensic accountant to conduct a complete audit of Conscious Closet's finances, with particular attention to any irregularities in expense reporting, salary arrangements, or asset transfers that might indicate financial misconduct. They had prepared legal documents to freeze business assets and prevent unauthorized transactions. And they had developed a timeline for asserting Margaret's majority control in ways that would protect her interests while exposing Emma's planned betrayal. The plan required precise timing and absolute commitment. Margaret would need to act decisively, knowing that once she began, there would be no possibility of reconciliation. The daughter she had raised and loved would become an opponent in a legal battle that would destroy their relationship forever. But Margaret had already accepted that the relationship she thought she had with Emma was an illusion. Emma's strategic plan had made that brutally clear. As Margaret watched Emma and David exchange rings, she felt the weight of the encrypted phone in her purse, loaded with photographs of Emma's strategic document and ready to transmit the evidence to Sarah at a moment's notice. The plan they had developed was elegant in its simplicity. Margaret would give Emma one final opportunity to reveal her intentions honestly, and when Emma inevitably chose deception over truth, Margaret would execute her legal response with the same calculated precision Emma had planned to use against her. The ceremony concluded with Emma and David's first kiss as husband and wife, and Margaret applauded with genuine emotion despite everything she now knew. Whatever Emma had become, whatever she had planned, she was still the daughter Margaret had carried to safety all those years ago. The betrayal was complete, but the love that had made it so devastating remained. During the cocktail hour, Margaret mingled with the guests, accepting congratulations on Emma's success and compliments about the beautiful wedding. She met David's parents, successful entrepreneurs who spoke approvingly of Emma's business acumen and David's plans for expanding their joint ventures. She chatted with Emma's friends from Northwestern, many of whom worked in Chicago's fashion and business community and were eager to network with the mother of such a successful entrepreneur. What struck Margaret most forcefully was how thoroughly she had been erased from Emma's narrative of success, even at her own daughter's wedding. Guests who asked about Emma's background heard stories about her college achievements, her innovative business model, and her rapid rise in Chicago's fashion scene. When Margaret's role was mentioned at all, it was in passing references to supportive family or strong values instilled during childhood. Not a single guest seemed aware that Margaret was Emma's business partner, much less her majority investor. Emma had constructed a public persona that excluded Margaret so completely that even at a family celebration, Margaret felt like a stranger to her daughter's life and achievements. The deception continued during the reception dinner, where Emma and David gave speeches that thanked everyone who had supported their relationship and their individual successes. Emma spoke movingly about her gratitude for everyone who believed in my dreams and helped me build something beautiful. She mentioned her college professors, her business mentors, her employees, and her customers. She thanked David's family for welcoming her and her own family for always supporting my independence and ambition. Margaret sat at the head table, smiling and nodding, while Emma systematically thanked everyone, except the person who had made her success possible. The speech was masterfully crafted to acknowledge family support. In abstract terms, while avoiding any specific recognition of Margaret's concrete contributions, even at her own wedding, Emma was maintaining the fiction that her success was entirely self-generated. After dinner, as guests moved to the dance floor and the evening shifted to celebration mode, David approached Margaret with the kind of confident smile she had learned to recognize as a prelude to manipulation. "Margaret," David said, settling into the chair beside her with the casual intimacy of a son-in-law, "I was hoping we could have a quick conversation about some business matters. Nothing too serious, just some exciting opportunities Emma and I have been discussing." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. This was the moment Emma's strategic document had prepared her for, the post-wedding financial extraction that would begin the systematic elimination of Margaret's involvement in their lives. "Of course," Margaret said calmly. "What kind of opportunities?" David's presentation was polished and persuasive, clearly the result of careful planning and rehearsal. He spoke enthusiastically about expansion opportunities for Conscious Closet, including plans for additional locations, an expanded online presence, and partnerships with major retailers. The projections were impressive, promising to multiply the business's current success several times over. "The opportunity is incredible," David said, his eyes bright with entrepreneurial excitement. "But the initial investment would be substantial. We're looking at about $50,000 to secure the prime retail locations and fund the marketing campaign for the national expansion." Margaret listened with growing amazement as David outlined exactly the scenario. Emma's strategic document had described an emotional appeal for additional investment, designed to extract more of Margaret's resources while positioning Emma and David to control the expanded business operations. Emma and I have been discussing how to structure this, David continued. Since you're the majority investor, we want to make sure you're comfortable with the arrangement. But frankly, the day-to-day management of multiple locations would be quite demanding, and Emma's really hit her stride with the operational side of things. We were thinking this might be a good time to restructure the partnership to give Emma more control over business decisions while ensuring you get a healthy return on your investments. The proposal was exactly what Emma's document had predicted. Pressure Margaret to provide additional funding while reducing her control and influence. David presented it as an opportunity for Margaret to step back and enjoy the rewards of her investment, while Emma and David handled the complexities of expansion. Margaret let David finish his pitch, watching his confident expression as he outlined the terms that would accomplish exactly what Emma had planned. Access Margaret's remaining resources while eliminating her from meaningful participation in the business's future. When David finished speaking, Margaret smiled and nodded thoughtfully. That sounds very interesting, David. You and Emma have clearly put a lot of thought into this. David beamed, interpreting Margaret's calm response as the compliance Emma's strategic document had predicted. We're so excited about the possibilities, and we really want you to be part of this expansion. Family is everything to us. Family is everything, Margaret repeated quietly. That's interesting that you mention that, because I've been thinking a lot about family lately, and about what we owe each other as family members. Something in Margaret's tone made David's expression shift slightly, but he maintained his confident smile. Of course, Emma and I both feel so grateful for everything you've done to support us. Support, Margaret said, as if testing the word. Yes, I suppose that's one way to describe it. David, I'm curious. When you and Emma were planning your expansion strategy, did you discuss with her exactly how much I invested in Conscious Closet originally? Well, yes, of course. We know you were incredibly generous in helping Emma get started. Generous, Margaret repeated. That's interesting. So you know that I invested my entire life savings, my complete retirement fund, that I took out a second mortgage on my house and personally guaranteed business loans that I'm still paying every month? David's confidence began to waver slightly. Yes, we understand you made a substantial investment. And you know that I own 51% of the business? That I'm not just an investor but actually the majority owner of Conscious Closet? Right, but Emma handles all the day-to-day operations. She does, Margaret agreed. She's very talented at operations. In fact, she's so talented that I've been wondering if there might be other operational decisions she's been making that I should know about. As the majority owner, I mean. David was now clearly uncomfortable, but he pressed forward with what was obviously a rehearsed response. Margaret, I think there might be some misunderstanding here. Emma and I aren't trying to cut you out of anything. We just want everyone to be happy and successful. Margaret smiled, and for the first time in weeks, her smile was entirely genuine. David, I think you're absolutely right that there's been a misunderstanding. In fact, I think there have been several very significant misunderstandings. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. With David watching in growing confusion, she typed a brief message and sent it. Within seconds, her phone chimed with a response. You know, David, I've learned so much in the past few weeks. I've learned about business partnerships, about legal protections for majority shareholders, and about the importance of documenting everything properly. Margaret's voice remained calm and conversational, but something in her tone made David lean back in his chair. I've also learned about forensic accounting, about asset freezing orders, and about what happens when majority owners exercise their full legal authority over business operations. Margaret looked directly at David with the kind of steady gaze she had once used to face down an abusive husband. Most importantly, I've learned that family loyalty should never be taken for granted. David's face had gone pale. Margaret, I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, David. I'm stating facts. For instance, it's a fact that, as of about 30 seconds ago, when I sent that text message to my attorney, Conscious Closet's bank accounts have been frozen pending a complete financial audit. David stared at her in shock. What are you talking about? I'm talking about protecting my investment, David. You see, when someone owns 51% of a business, they have the legal authority to initiate audits, freeze assets, and make unilateral decisions about business operations. I never exercised those rights before because I trusted Emma to manage the business honestly and in our mutual best interests. Margaret's smile remained steady as David's composure crumbled. But trust, as I've recently learned, can be a very expensive mistake. Margaret, there's been some kind of misunderstanding. We weren't trying to— Oh, but you were, David. You were trying to extract $50,000 from me while restructuring the partnership to eliminate my control over the business I made possible. You were trying to manipulate my love for Emma to convince me to fund my own marginalization. Margaret stood up, looking down at David with the calm authority of someone who had finally stopped being anyone's victim. The misunderstanding, David, was your assumption that I would remain ignorant and compliant while you and Emma implemented your strategic plan to exploit and discard me? David's shock was transforming into panic. I don't know what you think you know, but I know everything, David. I've read Emma's strategic document. I know about the post-wedding strategy and the financial extraction timeline, and the plan to achieve complete financial and emotional independence from the woman who funded your wife's success. Margaret reached into her purse again and pulled out a small envelope. I also know that in about 10 minutes, Emma is going to receive some documents that will clarify exactly who controls Conscious Closet and what the consequences are for trying to defraud your business partners. She handed the envelope to David. Give this to Emma when the servers find her. Tell her it's from her majority partner. Tell her we need to discuss the future of our business relationship. Honestly this time. Margaret walked away from David's stunned silence, leaving him holding the envelope that contained legal documents asserting her full control over Conscious Closet and initiating the audit that would expose every aspect of Emma and David's planned betrayal. As she moved through the reception, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, the cold satisfaction of refusing to be anyone's victim. Emma had taught her daughter to be strong, independent, and strategic. Now Emma was about to discover exactly how effective that teaching had been. The envelope reached Emma 20 minutes later, delivered by a visibly shaken David who had found his new wife posing for photographs with her college friends near the garden's rose arbor. Margaret watched from across the reception area as Emma opened the legal documents, her radiant bride's smile transforming into an expression of confusion, then shock, then something approaching panic. The documents Sarah had prepared were comprehensive and devastating. The first was a formal notice of Margaret's intention to exercise her full rights as majority shareholder of Conscious Closet, including immediate suspension of all unauthorized financial transactions and management decisions pending a complete audit of business operations. The second was a cease and desist order preventing Emma or David from accessing business accounts, making financial commitments, or representing themselves as having authority to make business decisions without Margaret's written approval. But it was the third document that truly shattered Emma's composure. A detailed summary of the forensic accountant's preliminary findings, documenting irregularities in expense reporting, unauthorized salary increases, and questionable transfers of business assets that suggested systematic financial misconduct. Margaret had not expected to feel satisfaction watching her daughter's world collapse in real time. But as Emma's face went pale and her hands began to tremble, Margaret discovered that justice could provide its own form of peace. For months, she had watched Emma accept credit for achievements that Margaret had made possible. Now Emma was learning what accountability looked like when it came from someone with the power to enforce it. Emma's immediate response was exactly what Margaret had predicted: damage control and manipulation. Within minutes of reading the documents, Emma was making her way through the reception crowd toward Margaret, her wedding dress trailing behind her as she moved with urgent determination. David followed at a distance, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. "Mom," Emma said, reaching Margaret's side with a strained smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment? I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." Margaret looked at her daughter, beautiful in her wedding dress, surrounded by the luxury and success that Margaret's investment had made possible, and felt a deep sadness for what they had both lost. "Of course, Emma, I think it's time we had an honest conversation." They walked to a quiet corner of the garden, away from the music and laughter of the reception. Emma's demeanor shifted the moment they were out of earshot of the guests. Her practiced smile replaced by the kind of desperate intensity Margaret recognized from Emma's childhood when she had been caught in a lie. "Mom, I don't know what you think you found, but there's been a huge misunderstanding," Emma began, her voice urgent and pleading. "David said something about frozen accounts and audits, but that's crazy. We're partners. We're family. Why would you do something like this at my wedding?" Margaret studied her daughter's face, looking for any trace of genuine remorse or honesty. Instead, she saw calculated desperation. Emma was not apologizing for her betrayal, but scrambling to manage its exposure. "Emma," Margaret said quietly, "I found your strategic document. I read your plan to extract my remaining resources while eliminating me from the business and your life. I know about the post-wedding strategy and the financial extraction timeline and your analysis of my psychological vulnerabilities." Emma's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally a kind of cold assessment that reminded Margaret of Richard during his most manipulative moments. When Emma spoke again, her voice had lost its pleading tone and taken on the clinical precision Margaret had read in the strategic document. "You went through my personal computer," Emma said, as if Margaret's violation of privacy was the real issue at stake. "You invaded my privacy and took something completely out of context." Out of context? Margaret felt a flash of anger that surprised her with its intensity. "Emma, you wrote a detailed plan to manipulate and discard me. You analyzed my love for you as a weakness to exploit. You calculated how to access my resources while making my continued involvement uncomfortable and unsustainable. What context makes that acceptable?" Emma was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a hardness that Margaret had never heard before. "You don't understand business, Mom. You don't understand what it takes to grow a company or manage investor relationships. That document was just contingency planning, thinking through different scenarios. Investor relationships?" Margaret stared at her daughter in disbelief. "Emma, I'm not an investor. I'm your mother. I'm your business partner. I liquidated my entire life savings to make your dreams possible. And you wrote a strategic plan to steal everything I have left." "Steal?" Emma's voice rose slightly before she caught herself and returned to her controlled tone. "Mom, you're being dramatic. The document was about managing our business relationship professionally as the company grows. Family businesses are complicated, and we needed to think through how to handle the transition as Conscious Closet expands." Margaret realized that even now, even caught in her betrayal, Emma was incapable of acknowledging what she had planned to do. The strategic document hadn't been a momentary lapse in judgment or a product of poor advice from David. It had been a methodical plan, created by someone who viewed Margaret's love and trust as resources to be mined and eventually discarded. "Emma," Margaret said, her voice carrying the kind of final authority she had used when Emma was a child. "You plan to cheat me out of my investment, exclude me from the business I made possible, and manipulate my emotions to make me grateful for my own exploitation. That's not business management. That's fraud." For the first time, Emma's composure cracked completely. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You don't know anything about business or legal partnerships or—" Emma stopped herself, taking a deep breath and trying to regain control. "Mom, let's just calm down and talk about this rationally. Maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement that makes everyone happy. The business is doing well, and there's plenty of success to share." The offer was exactly what Emma's strategic document had predicted Margaret would accept. Vague promises of sharing success designed to prevent Margaret from exercising her legal rights. But Margaret was no longer the trusting woman who had signed over her life savings without independent legal advice. "Emma, the time for arrangements was before you planned to betray me. Now we're going to handle this through lawyers and accountants and auditors who will document exactly what you've done and what you owe me." Emma's facade finally collapsed entirely. You can't do this to me. This is my wedding day. This is my business. I built Conscious Closet from nothing, and you're trying to destroy everything I've worked for. From nothing? Margaret's voice was very quiet, but it carried a finality that made Emma stop talking. Emma, you built Conscious Closet from my life savings, my retirement security, and my home equity. You built it from decades of my sacrifice and years of my financial support, and you plan to keep everything while discarding me like an inconvenience. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, showing Emma the photographs she had taken of the strategic document. The auditors will be very interested in comparing your public statements about building the business from nothing with your private acknowledgement of exactly how much money I invested and continue to pay. Emma stared at the phone screen, seeing her own words documented and preserved. For the first time, she seemed to understand that her betrayal had been discovered not just emotionally, but legally, with evidence that could be used in court proceedings. "What do you want?" Emma asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret looked at her daughter, this woman she had raised and loved and sacrificed everything to support, and felt the last remnants of their old relationship dissolve completely. "I want justice, Emma. I want an accurate accounting of every dollar I invested and every dollar the business has earned. I want transparency about how you've managed the company and whether you've stolen from our partnership. And I want you to understand that your plan to manipulate and discard me was the biggest mistake of your life." Margaret turned to walk away, then paused and looked back at Emma one final time. "Your strategic document was very thorough, Emma, but you made one critical error in your analysis of my vulnerabilities. You assumed that my love for you would always override my ability to protect myself. You were wrong." As Margaret walked away from her daughter's wedding reception, leaving Emma standing alone in her designer dress among the roses and baby's breath, she felt something she hadn't experienced since the night she fled Phoenix with 7-year-old Emma, the terrible freedom that comes from refusing to be anyone's victim. Behind her, she could hear Emma beginning to cry, not the tears of remorse or genuine emotion, but the frustrated sobs of someone whose carefully laid plans had been exposed and destroyed. Margaret didn't look back. The woman who had once sacrificed everything out of love had finally learned the difference between love and exploitation, between family loyalty and enabling betrayal. The audit would take months to complete, the legal proceedings would be expensive and emotionally devastating, and the relationship with her daughter was beyond repair. But for the first time in decades, Margaret's future belonged entirely to her, shaped by her own choices rather than her willingness to sacrifice for someone else's dreams. The wedding guests would remember this as the night when Emma Walsh's perfect celebration was destroyed by some mysterious family drama. They would never know that it was actually the night when Margaret Walsh finally stopped being a victim and started being the majority shareholder of her own life. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the doorway of her new bakery in Fort Collins, Colorado, watching the morning sun stream through the large front windows she had installed to showcase the display cases filled with fresh pastries, artisanal breads, and custom cakes. The sweet spot wasn't glamorous like Conscious Closet had been. There were no fashion influencers or magazine features, no networking events or expansion plans. But every morning when Margaret unlocked the door and turned on the ovens, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: complete ownership of her own success. The legal proceedings had taken 4 months to resolve, during which the forensic audit revealed exactly what Margaret had suspected. Emma had systematically inflated her salary, charged personal expenses to the business, and transferred company assets to accounts she controlled jointly with David. The total amount of embezzled funds exceeded $30,000. But more importantly, the audit had documented a pattern of financial misconduct that validated Margaret's decision to exercise her majority ownership rights. The settlement had been swift once Emma's legal team realized the strength of Margaret's position. Rather than face potential criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud, Emma had agreed to sell her minority stake back to Margaret at a court-determined fair market value. Margaret now owned 100% of Conscious Closet, valued at $1.4 million by independent appraisers. But Margaret had no interest in running a fashion boutique in Chicago. Within weeks of gaining full control, she had sold Conscious Closet to a sustainable fashion collective for $1.2 million, retaining the original business name and ensuring that the employees Emma had hired would keep their jobs under new management. The sale had generated enough profit to pay off all her remaining debts, including the second mortgage on her Denver house and the business loans that had been hanging over her head for years. For the first time since Emma's college graduation, Margaret was completely debt-free, with substantial savings and the freedom to choose her own path forward. She had used part of her profits to buy a small house in Fort Collins, a college town with a vibrant community and lower cost of living than Chicago or Denver. The remaining money had gone into a diversified investment portfolio managed by a financial advisor who understood Margaret's need for security and steady growth rather than aggressive speculation. The sweet spot had been Margaret's deliberate choice, a business simple enough that she could manage it herself, profitable enough to provide a comfortable living, and personally meaningful in ways that fashion retail had never been. Margaret had always been a talented baker, creating birthday cakes and holiday cookies for Emma throughout her childhood, but she had never considered turning her skills into a profession. Now, at 53, she was discovering the satisfaction of building something entirely her own. The bakery reflected Margaret's hard-won wisdom about sustainable success. She had hired 3 part-time employees who shared her commitment to quality and customer service. But she maintained personal control over all financial decisions and business operations. She worked reasonable hours, took Sundays off, and had built a customer base that appreciated consistency and craftsmanship rather than trendy innovation. Most importantly, Margaret had learned to separate her business success from her need for validation from others. The Sweet Spot's profits belonged entirely to her. Its reputation was built on her own skills and efforts, and its future depended on her decisions rather than her willingness to sacrifice for someone else's dreams. The personal cost of her transformation had been substantial. Emma had made several attempts to contact Margaret in the months following the wedding, but Margaret had maintained strict no-contact boundaries enforced through her attorney. Emma's calls went unanswered, her emails were forwarded to Sarah Martinez without being read, and her attempts to visit Margaret's Denver house were met with a security system and a trespass warning. Margaret had learned through Sarah that Emma and David were struggling to rebuild their lives after the collapse of their expansion plans and the loss of Conscious Closet. David's family had distanced themselves from the couple after learning about the embezzlement, and Emma's reputation in Chicago's fashion community had been damaged by the scandal. They had moved to Minneapolis, where David had taken a corporate job, and Emma was working for someone else's boutique while attempting to rebuild her credibility. The information brought Margaret no satisfaction, but it also generated no sympathy. Emma was experiencing the consequences of her choices, learning what life was like without access to Margaret's resources and support. Margaret hoped that the hardship might eventually lead Emma to genuine self-reflection and growth, but she was no longer willing to sacrifice her own well-being to cushion Emma's journey toward maturity. The most unexpected aspect of Margaret's new life was the peace she had found in solitude. For decades, her identity had been defined by her relationships with others, first as a victim of Richard's abuse, then as Emma's devoted mother and business partner. Now, for the first time in her adult life, Margaret was discovering who she was when she wasn't sacrificing for someone else's benefit. She had developed friendships with other small business owners in Fort Collins, joined a book club at the local library, and begun taking pottery classes at the community college. These relationships were based on mutual interest and respect rather than financial dependence or family obligation, and Margaret found them refreshingly uncomplicated. She had also begun dating occasionally, something that would have been unimaginable during her years of working multiple jobs to support Emma's education. Tom Bradley, a divorced history professor at Colorado State University, had become a regular customer at the Sweet Spot and eventually a regular dinner companion. Their relationship was developing slowly and naturally, built on genuine compatibility rather than desperation or need. "You seem different from most people I meet," Tom had said during one of their early conversations. "More settled in yourself, if that makes sense. Like you know exactly who you are and what you want." Margaret had smiled, understanding that what Tom recognized as confidence was actually hard-won wisdom. She did know who she was now. She was someone who had learned to distinguish between love and manipulation, between generosity and enabling, between family loyalty and self-destruction. The knowledge had come at a tremendous cost, but it had also given her something invaluable: the ability to build a life based on her own choices rather than other people's needs. On quiet mornings at the Sweet Spot, when Margaret was preparing the day's pastries before the bakery opened, she sometimes thought about the woman she had been when Emma was young, desperate, financially vulnerable, and willing to sacrifice anything for her daughter's success. That woman had been driven by love and hope, but also by a deep fear that she wasn't worthy of protection or consideration. The woman Margaret had become understood that love without boundaries was not love at all, but a form of self-destruction that ultimately served no one. She had raised Emma to be strong and independent, but she had failed to teach her that strength and independence should never be used to exploit the people who make them possible. The lesson had come too late to save their relationship, but it had arrived in time to save Margaret's life. At 53, she was finally living for herself rather than through someone else, building success that belonged entirely to her and would never be threatened by another person's betrayal or ingratitude. As Margaret arranged fresh croissants in the display case and prepared for another day of serving customers who appreciated her work, she felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with profit margins or public recognition. She had built something sustainable and meaningful with her own hands, her own skills, and her own resources. She had learned that the most important business partnership was the one she had with herself, and she intended to honor that partnership for the rest of her life. The Sweet Spot was more than a bakery. It was Margaret's declaration of independence, her proof that it was never too late to stop being someone's victim and start being your own success story. And unlike the boutique that had once threatened to destroy her, this success could never be taken away, because it belonged entirely to the woman who had finally learned the difference between sacrifice and strength. Outside the bakery windows, Fort Collins was waking up to another beautiful Colorado morning, and Margaret Walsh was ready to serve customers who valued what she had built, customers who had no idea that the woman behind the counter had once risked everything for someone else's dream and had finally learned to dream for herself.